This video is about the unforgettable battles of World War II in Europe. Subscribe for more. In the chilling dawn of May 1940, the skies over Europe bled a deep orange as war raged. Just outside the French town of Sedan, a formidable German army, emboldened by swift victories in Poland, prepared to unleash its deadly blitzkrieg on unsuspecting Allied forces. Among the soldiers, Lieutenant James Jimmy Harrington of the Army stood firm, his rifle gripped tightly in his calloused hands. He was not merely a soldier, he was a burgeoning leader, tasked with guiding his men through the uncertain tides of impending combat. Across the battlefield, Sergeant Klaus Richter, a veteran of the Wehrmacht, surveyed the lines with a mix of pride and trepidation. He has seen too much of the horrors of war but believed firmly in the cause of the Third Reich. With each advancing tank, he felt the pulse of history quickening as a new chapter of conquest awaited. The air crackled with tension as German tanks rolled forward, engines rumbling like distant thunder, a harbinger of chaos. As the first shells exploded, sending plumes of dirt and debris skyward, Jimmy and his squad took cover behind the remnants of a shattered wall. The sound of gunfire blared, punctuated by the cries of the wounded. "Stay low. Keep your heads down," he shouted, trying to keep his men steady amidst the chaos. Fear gnawed at their resolve, but survival instinct kicked in as they returned fire, chips of stone ricocheting off the ground around them. Meanwhile, in the obscured halls of Powback in Washington, the whispers of conflict echoed louder. President Franklin D. Roosevelt believed that America could no longer afford to be a bystander. The Nazis' swift advancement was a direct threat to freedom itself, and soon the wheels of action would turn decisively in favor of intervention. But how? The mystery of the right response hung in the air like a storm cloud, threatening to unleash its fury. Amidst the turmoil, an unexpected figure emerged, Captain Miriam Levy, a young military strategist hailing from Tel Aviv. She was not a soldier in the traditional sense, but her intellect and insights were invaluable. Following the rise of Nazism, she had dedicated herself to studying the tactics of the German forces and was determined to ensure that her homeland, still recovering from the scars of war in Europe, would not become another victim. Miriam's resolve had been tested time and again. As she stood within the confines of a war room, analyzing maps and data, she felt the weight of responsibility. "If we do not act now, we risk losing everything," she insisted during a heated meeting with British allies, her voice steady, yet urgent. They were still debating whether to fully engage with the Axis powers, and the threat felt distant to many, but she knew better. Back on the ground, the battle for Sedan reached a fever pitch. Jimmy's squad pushed back relentlessly, but the Germans were relentless, their strategies honed to a deadly edge. "They're reflanking us," shouted Private Collins, panic evident in his young voice. "We need to retreat." But retreat was not an option for Jimmy. He had made a promise to his men and to himself that they would not abandon their position. A deafening roar erupted as a panzer tank fired, narrowly missing their shelter. Shrapnel flew through the air, and Jimmy felt the sting of fear tinging his resolve. He glanced at the faces of his squad, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and determination. "We hold the line," he bellowed, channeling every ounce of his spirit into those words. "For our families, for our country." As the morning wore on, it became clear that this battle was not merely a strategic engagement, it was a fight for the very soul of Europe. The Allies needed a turning point, a glimmer of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. Unbeknownst to the soldiers on the front lines, a clandestine operation was being woven together, one that involved Miriam's insights and the collaboration of American and British forces, aiming to thwart the Nazi advance. Days turned into weeks, and the conflict escalated. The Battle of France had begun in earnest, a brutal reminder of the cost of war. The Allies fought with valor, but the German forces pressed on, executing a series of devastating maneuvers that left cities in ruins and hope fading. In the quiet of a night filled with the distant sounds of gunfire, Jimmy sat with his men around a flickering campfire. A sense of camaraderie bloomed amidst the chaos. They shared stories of home, dreams of peace, and the longing for a life untouched by the horrors of war. "If we survive this," Jimmy promised, "I'll take you all fishing in the lakes of Minnesota." His words sparked laughter, a momentary reprieve from the grim reality surrounding them. But beneath the surface of brotherhood, tension brewed. Doubt crept into their minds, and whispers of fear spread among the ranks. They were outnumbered, under-resourced, and faced an enemy that showed no remorse. Each clash with the Germans revealed the stark differences in tactics and resolve, and as the Allied forces struggled to adapt, a sense of desperation loomed. Meanwhile, in the war room in London, Miriam's warnings echoed through the chambers. We must disrupt their lines of supply. This is where their strength lies. We need to coordinate airstrikes and sabotage their resources, she insisted, her voice a beacon of clarity amid the chaos of strategies being debated. But the reality was grim. Time was running out as the Germans marched relentlessly onward. In the shadows of the unfolding conflict, whispers of potential uprising among the German resistance began to surface. Some soldiers, disillusioned by the brutality of the regime, sought a way to sabotage their own forces. Rumors of dissent spread through the ranks, a flicker of hope amidst the overwhelming tide of aggression. Klaus Richter, haunted by the memories of his fallen comrades, found himself torn between duty and conscience. Would he dare to join the ranks of those who sought to disrupt the very machine he had once believed in? As the dawn of June approached, the tension reached a boiling point. The Allies prepared for a counter-offensive, a last stand with the potential to change the tides of war in Europe. Jimmy, Klaus, and Miriam were unknowingly bound together by the same threads of fate, each grappling with their own conflicts and the roles they would play in the crucible of destiny. The air was thick with anticipation as both sides prepared for what would be known as the Battle of Dunkirk, a desperate retreat or a turning point in the war, where lives and futures would hinge on the decisions made in the heat of battle. As the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, the world held its breath. Would the Allies find victory against the relentless German forces? Could the spark of resistance ignite change from within? The answers lay on the cusp of chaos, waiting to be forged in the fires of war as the stage was set for a clash that would resonate through history. And so the battle began, with each moment holding the promise of heroism, sacrifice, and the unyielding spirit of humanity. In the shadows of conflict, heroes would rise, destinies would clash, and the very essence of freedom hung in the balance. The question remained, what sacrifices would be demanded to reclaim a war-torn Europe, and who would emerge from the ashes when the dust finally settled? The air was thick with uncertainty, and the next chapter awaited, poised to unfold with the fury of war and the resolve of those who dared to fight for a world reborn. As dawn broke over Dunkirk, Lieutenant Jimmy Harrington felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The shimmering coastline was a bittersweet sight. Evacuating troops would either mark a retreat or a regrouping of Allied forces. The realization that they were fighting not just for survival, but for the very future of Europe struck him with renewed vigor. The air was heavy with the acrid scent of gunpowder, mingling with the salty breeze of the sea, a constant reminder of the stakes at hand. Jimmy commanded, rallying his men. Each soldier's face displayed a mix of fear and determination, their eyes reflecting the chaos unfolding around them. He could see the German forces advancing relentlessly, a dark tide rolling over the horizon, encroaching upon the flickering light of hope. Tanks rolled ominously along the beaches, their metal hulls reflecting the early sun-like predators preparing to pounce. Nearby, Sergeant Klaus Richter watched from the German lines, gripping his rifle with a sense of unease. The orders had come down to push the Allies into the sea, to deliver a definitive blow. Yet, as he surveyed the chaotic scene, he felt the conflict within him intensify. Would his actions contribute to the very tyranny he had begun to question? Every round fired to the Allied troops felt like a betrayal of his own conscience, yet loyalty to his comrades tugged at him like a noose. Across the waters, Captain Miriam Levy, still coordinating strategies from afar, felt the urgency racing through her veins. The situation was growing dire, and the Allied forces were outnumbered. Reports flooded in of the German advance, but Miriam understood that the real battle would not just be fought on land, but in the air and within the hearts of the soldiers on both sides. She could see the fractures within the Wehrmacht, signs of dissent beginning to rise. If we can just hold them long enough for air support to arrive, we might just have a chance, she muttered to herself, her mind working furiously. Back at Dunkirk, a cacophony of gunfire and explosions drowned out all thoughts of retreat. Jimmy shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "We will not give in." As he raised his rifle, the sound of a shell exploding nearby sent vibrations through the ground, a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. His squad returned fire, bullets streaking towards the approaching tanks and infantry. Each shot echoed a defiance that rang true in the hearts of his men, a testament to their resolve. In the distance, a series of explosions erupted as Allied aircraft swooped low, delivering much-needed air support. The roar of engines filled the sky, and for a moment, the tide seemed to turn. Miriam watched intently from her distant command post, hoping against hope that their efforts would pay off. "Come on, you can do this," she whispered, her fingers crossed as the planes released their payloads over the German lines. Yet the German forces were relentless. Klaus, even as he questioned his allegiance, found himself drawn into the fray. He led the charge, trying to rally his comrades, pushing them to exploit the confusion among the Allied troops. He roared, a temporary surge of fervor propelling him into the fray. His men responded, though Klaus could see the hesitation in their eyes as doubts began to settle in about the righteousness of their cause. As the battle raged on, Jimmy's squad held their ground fiercely. They were outnumbered, but desperation turned into an unyielding will to fight for survival. "We need to fall back to the tracks," Collins yelled, desperation creeping into his voice. Jimmy shook his head, grim determination solidifying his stance. "We hold this position. If we fall back now, we lose everything." The sound of distant artillery fire echoed through the chaos, a clashing of wills. Each explosion sent a tremor through Jimmy's bones, but he remained steadfast, urging his men to look beyond the immediate chaos. "For every second we hold them back, we give our allies time to regroup," he shouted, embodying the spirit of those who realized they were fighting for more than just themselves. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the battlefield, hope glimmered faintly. Allied ships began to approach the beach, their hulls heavy with soldiers desperate to escape the clutches of the advancing Germans. The sight rejuvenated Jimmy's resolve. He pointed, almost breathless. Klaus, too, felt a mix of hope and dread as he saw the ships. The moment seemed almost surreal, a merging of two worlds threatened by the abyss of war. He hesitated, watching the frantic movement of troops and vehicles on the beach. He muttered to himself, the question echoing through the tumult. The battle in Dunkirk crystallized into a blur of movement and sound. Jimmy's squad fought valiantly, repelling wave after wave of German forces, but fatigue was a relentless beast, gnawing at their edges. "We can't hold them forever," Collins yelled, his voice tinged with panic. "We need to find a way to evacuate." Jimmy felt the seams of their defense starting to unravel. "We will buy them time. We will fight until every last one of our brothers is aboard those ships," he shouted, rallying his men like a true leader amid the impending storm. The air was thick with smoke and desperation. Miriam, now fully aware of the critical juncture reached through her insides, took a calculated risk. She commanded her allies in the war room. "We need to create diversions, draw them away from the beach." As the Allied forces executed her orders, explosions erupted in the distance, drawing the attention of the German troops. It was a shift, a glimmer of opportunity. Klaus felt the tide of battle shift, and against his better judgment, he found himself questioning his orders. Would he remain a soldier in a broken machine, or could he become the very change he yearned for? Jimmy shouted as the Allied troops began to fall back in an organized retreat towards the ships. "We push forward. Give them cover." Each soldier moved with a sense of purpose, knowing that every second spent holding the line could mean life or death for the countless others boarding the vessels. As bullets whizzed by, Jimmy felt the pulse of the battle quickening. He caught sight of a German sniper taking aim from a nearby building, his heart racing. "Cover me," he called out as he dashed towards a crumbling structure, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He took a quick breath, steadied his rifle, and fired, the shot echoing through the chaos. The sniper fell, and Jimmy felt a surge of triumph, albeit fleeting. But just as victory seemed within reach, a deafening explosion erupted nearby, throwing him off balance. He tumbled to the ground, confusion swelling around him, the world spinning as he struggled to regain his footing. The stakes had never felt higher, and as the dust settled, he could see his men moving towards the beach, their spirits ignited by the winds of change. Amidst the chaos, Klaus faced a decision that could change his fate forever. The sounds of battle faded as he witnessed the desperation of the Allied forces. Could he turn against the tide he had once embraced? The flicker of resistance within him ignited, and with a newfound resolve, he began moving towards the lines of his own troops, determination fueling his actions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the battlefield, the Battle of Dunkirk surged forward into its climax. The soldiers of both sides were caught in the throes of conflict, yet within the chaos, the flickers of humanity began to break through. The choices they made in those pivotal moments would not only shape their destinies, but influence the course of history itself. As gunfire echoed, and the ships prepared to take the weary soldiers to safety, the next chapter of their fates awaited. The fight for Europe continued, and deep within their hearts, the longing for freedom and justice would spur them on, even in the face of insurmountable odds. As the battle raged on, the question loomed ever larger: who would emerge as the true victors in this war of ideologies and aspirations, and what sacrifices would they be willing to make for the future? The answers awaited them on the brink of history, where courage and conscience would collide in the heart of Europe. Amidst the cacophony of the Battle of Dunkirk, Lieutenant Jimmy Harrington struggled to maintain his footing. The explosion had knocked him to the ground, and he felt disoriented, but the urgency of the situation quickly pierced through his haze. He scrambled to his feet, wiping the dust from his face, and surveyed the beach. The Allied troops were engaged in a fierce struggle to board the ships that lined the shore, their only hope for survival. The roar of engines and cries of soldiers echoed around him, each sound a reminder of the stakes at hand. Jimmy shouted, urging his men forward. They were a thin line against the tide of German forces, but they fought with a tenacity born from desperation. Each moment they held their ground, bought time for the others to escape. The sand beneath their feet was stained with the sacrifices of those who had come before them, and Jimmy felt an overarching responsibility weighing heavy on his shoulders, a responsibility not just to his men, but to the future of Europe itself. Meanwhile, Sergeant Klaus Richter, standing on the precipice of his own moral dilemma, felt the tide of the battle shift around him. The ferocity of the Allied forces held him captive, forcing him to confront the lies he had long believed. Every shot fired reminded him of the humanity lost in this senseless conflict, and he envisioned a different future, one where strength was measured not by conquest but compassion. Push forward. Klaus rallied his men, but a part of him hesitated. He could see the desperation in the faces of the Allied soldiers. Their humanity lay bare in the chaos of war. He could no longer ignore the gnawing doubt that had taken root in his heart. As he urged his troops onward, he began to reassess his place in this brutal machine. Was he a cog, or could he be a catalyst for change? On the other side of the English Channel, Captain Miriam Levy continued her strategic calculations. In her command room, the atmosphere was thick with tension as reports of the battle streamed in. Though physically distant, she felt an emotional connection to the soldiers fighting on the front lines. She knew their fates were intertwined with the survival of not only their nations, but also the ideals of freedom and justice. She urged the officers in the room, her voice rising above the murmur of anxious strategists. If we can manage to hold off the German advance for just a little longer, we may turn this tide. The officers exchanged glances, their faces etched with worry, but Miriam's conviction sparked a flicker of hope. They began to organize their support to disrupt the German lines, knowing that time was of the essence. With each passing moment, hope hung delicately in the balance. Back at Dunkirk, Jimmy felt the heat of battle intensify. The German forces were pushing hard, their tanks rumbling like thunder as they advanced. "We need to create a barrier," he shouted to his squad, formulating a plan amidst the gunfire. "Private Collins, you and Johnson take the left flank. We'll draw them in, then hit them from the side." Collins nodded, adrenaline coursing through him. The fear that had gripped him earlier had transformed into a steely determination. "Let us do it," he yelled before sprinting into position with Johnson. As they executed their maneuver, blasts of gunfire erupted around them. Jimmy was consumed by a mix of fear and fervor, each heartbeat reminding him of the stakes. He could see the German soldiers advancing, their faces a mask of aggression and purpose. He shouted, squeezing the trigger, sending bullets into the approaching ranks. Klaus found himself caught in the moment of conflict, his soldiers pressing forward, but his heart wavering. He couldn't shake the image of the Allied troops, fighting for their lives, and he felt the churning of a new resolve within him. "We need to slow down," he called to his comrades. "We can't just blindly follow orders." His words were met with confusion and anger, but he pressed on. "Look around you. We're tearing apart lives for what? For a regime that doesn't care about us." A few of his fellow soldiers glanced at him, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Klaus took a deep breath, knowing he had crossed a line. "We can choose to fight differently," he urged. As Dunkirk battled on, the skies above became a battleground of their own. Allied aircraft swooped low, delivering much-needed airstrikes on the advancing German forces. Miriam's strategy unfolded like a well-rehearsed dance, each aircraft moving in perfect unison. The bomb explosions tore through the ranks of German soldiers, creating chaos among their formations. Miriam encouraged her team, watching the screen with a fierce intensity. "We're making an impact. We can turn this fight into a victory." Yet, as the German lines buckled under the airstrikes, Klaus felt a surge of guilt. He could see the devastation through the smoke. He couldn't reconcile the destruction with the sense of duty he had sworn to uphold. "This isn't right," he shouted to his men, desperation lacing his voice. "We need to help them, not destroy them." Stunned silence met his declaration, and for a moment the clamor of battle faded. A few soldiers exchanged looks, uncertainty bubbling beneath the surface of their resolve. Klaus seized the moment, his voice steady. We can turn back. We can be the ones who stop this madness. As Jimmy continued to lead his squad in a fierce fight against the German advance, he caught glimpses of the struggle within Class S ranks. He could see the flicker of dissent in the eyes of some German soldiers. Perhaps the tide was beginning to shift in ways beyond the battlefield. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, urging him to push forward, not just for victory, but for a chance at a better future. Advance, Jimmy shouted, leading his men in a bold maneuver that caught the German forces off guard. They charged forward, weapons raised, embodying the spirit of resistance that echoed through the trenches of war. Each soldier fought not just for survival, but for the hope of a world where the ideals of freedom would prevail over oppression. As the battle raged on, the beaches of Dunkirk began to fill with the weary yet determined faces of Allied soldiers boarding the ships. The evacuations commenced amidst the turmoil, a flicker of hope glimmering brightly against the dark backdrop of despair. But time was slipping through their fingers, and the German forces were regrouping for one final push. Cover the retreat, Jimmy cried, his heart pounding as he orchestrated the defense, knowing that their very survival hinged on their next actions. He fired into the advancing ranks, the sound of gunfire ringing in his ears, the stakes higher than ever before. Klaus felt the pressure mounting. His comrades were rallying, but he sensed the fragility of their spirits. He yelled to them, a quiet resolve building within him. We can't fight for tyranny any longer. He knew that he was risking everything, but the prospect of doing the right thing burned brightly. With their respective fates entwined, Jimmy and Klaus stood on opposite sides of a battlefield that would define not only their lives but the future of Europe. The echoes of gunfire and the cries of the wounded filled the air, but beneath it all lay a burgeoning hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the ideals for which they fought would triumph over the horrors of war. As night fell over Dunkirk, the sounds of battle began to fade. The first ships had successfully evacuated many soldiers, but the fight was far from over. With the German forces closing in, it would take every ounce of courage and conviction to secure their escape. In the shadows, Miriam continued to strategize, feeling the pulse of the battle in her veins. The decisions being made on the front line would determine the direction of the conflict, and she knew her insights could play a crucial role. The question lingered in the air: would the tide of war turn in favor of freedom and justice, or would the darkness of tyranny prevail as history hung in the balance? The next chapter awaited, ready to be written in the blood and sacrifice of those daring to fight for a brighter tomorrow. The chaos of Dunkirk echoed like thunder in the hearts of soldiers on both sides. Lieutenant Jimmy Harrington felt the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest as he led his men against the relentless German advance. The last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, casting a haunting glow over the battlefield, where hope and despair danced together in a deadly waltz. Keep firing. We can let them breach our lines, Jimmy shouted, his voice a rallying cry against the encroaching storm of soldiers that threatened to snuff out their chance for survival. Amidst the chaos, Sergeant Klaus Richter struggled with the turmoil within. His resolve to fight was crumbling under the weight of the atrocities he had witnessed. Deep inside, a voice urged him to reevaluate his purpose. This isn't the war we signed up for, he uttered to a group of soldiers, their faces a mixture of confusion and doubt. We are not savages, we are men, we can choose a different path. His words hung in the air, a flicker of rebellion against the doctrine that had driven them. As they pressed on, Jimmy's men fought valiantly, pushing back against the relentless waves of the German assault. They utilized every tactic they had learned, improvising defenses with whatever they could find. Collins, over there, grabbed that crate, Jimmy yelled, pointing towards a stack of supplies nearby. The private nodded, adrenaline surging through him, and dashed to retrieve the crates to build makeshift barricades. Each step they took was not merely a fight against an enemy, but a struggle for the very ideals they held dear. Back on the command front, Captain Miriam Levy remained focused on the tactical map sprawled before her, lines and dots representing the fates of countless soldiers. She knew that their success hinged on her ability to maintain coordination across the battlefield. If we can hold them off for just a bit longer, we might turn the tide, she urged through the officers at her side, her voice sparking a renewed sense of urgency. As the night deepened, the sounds of war morphed into a symphony of chaos. Allied ships were increasingly visible on the horizon, their lights flickering like fireflies amidst the darkness. For the soldiers on the beach, it signaled a chance one they desperately clung to. Colin shouted, excitement coursing through his voice. The ships, they're coming for us. Jimmy could feel the energy surge through his men, even as the Germans pressed forward. We hold this line until they get everyone aboard. We read the last barrier. he declared, channeling every ounce of his resolve into those words. The determination in his eyes inspired those around him. Despite the mounting exhaustion and the stench of gunpowder filling the air, they pushed back with great ferocity, fulfilling their promise of courage against insurmountable odds. Klaus, caught in the dilemma between duty and conscience, felt the turmoil of conflicting emotions swirling within him. He watched as his fellow soldiers pressed forward, their faces lit with the fervor of belief, yet shadows of doubt began to creep into their expressions. "We can keep doing this," he shouted over the cacophony, his voice rising above the din of gunfire. "We redestroying lives for a regime that doesn't care about us. We better than this." For a moment, silence enveloped him as the soldiers around him paused, the air thick with uncertainty. Klaus sensed a shift, a hesitation among the ranks. Some soldiers lowered their weapons, gazing at Klaus with questioning eyes. They seemed to ponder, the weight of his conviction echoing in their hearts. As the German forces surged, Klaus felt the urgency to act. "We can fight, but we can also choose to save our humanity," he implored, his words laced with a sincerity born of desperation. A few of his comrades exchanged glances, the flicker of rebellion igniting in their spirits. The tide of dissent began to grow, but would it be enough to sway the battleless outcome? Meanwhile, the Allied forces began to mount a desperate stand. Jimmy's men fought with unwavering resolve as German forces closed in. "Fall back to the beach, we'll cover you," a voice from the back yelled, and the soldiers began to retreat toward the ships, moving with urgency. Jimmy felt the pressure mount, but he couldn't abandon his men. "Advance," he shouted one last time, his voice cutting through the night air. He charged forward, rifle raised, ready to meet the oncoming tide. The last remnants of daylight faded as darkness enveloped the battlefield, yet the glint of hope shone brighter than the stars above. The battle raged on as Miriam's air support swooped in, dropping bombs into the German ranks. She urged her allies, the urgency spilling forth from her lips. The explosion sent shockwaves through the German lines, causing momentary chaos amid the advancing soldiers. Klaus seized the opportunity. He turned to his fellow soldiers. "This is our chance. We can change this fight." But with renewed determination, he led his comrades toward the beach, aiming to protect those who wished to escape the horrors of war. The lines began to blur as the chaos of battle transformed into something resembling a unified resistance. Soldiers on both sides felt the weight of humanity pressing down upon them. As Jimmy continued to cover the retreat, he noticed a group of German soldiers hesitating, weapons lowered. "Hold your fire," he called out in a moment of clarity. "We are all men fighting for our beliefs. We can choose not to be enemies." Klaus heard Jimmy's call, the gravity of his words echoing in his mind. As he looked around, he saw the same conflict mirrored in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. "Stop shooting. We can find a way out of this madness," he shouted, his voice rising above the din of battle. The tide of dissent surged, and a ripple of uncertainty coursed through their ranks. Some German soldiers began to lower their weapons, torn between fear of their commanding officers and the growing realization of their shared humanity. The ship horns sounded ominously in the distance, a reminder that time was running out. Jimmy and Klaus stood on opposite sides of the battlefield, each embodying the struggle between duty and conscience. In that moment, they recognized each other across the divide. "We can be better," Klaus shouted, his voice filled with newfound conviction as he began to step forward, slowly lowering his weapon. With the air thick with tension, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The battle no longer felt like an inevitable clash, but rather an opportunity for connection. The men around them began to lower their rifles, uncertainty lingering. Together, Jimmy called, summoning the strength of shared humanity. "We fight for our lives, not for tyranny. We can change this." The German soldiers, slowly lowering their weapons, found their voices. "For our families," one shouted, and another echoed, "For freedom." The clash of arms morphed into a tentative truce as the realization dawned that they were united in their desire for a better future. And just like that, the chaos of Dunkirk transformed into a powerful testament to the human spirit. In the midst of a war that sought to divide, the soldiers chose to unite. As the last of the fleeing Allied troops boarded the ships, they looked back towards the German soldiers who had laid down their weapons. Klaus took a step back, filled with a profound sense of purpose. He turned to Jimmy, his eyes filled with hope. "We did it. That's just the beginning," Jimmy replied, the weight of their shared struggle lifting. As the final soldiers boarded, the ships began to pull away from the shores of Dunkirk. The darkness of war still loomed, but the seeds of change had been planted. In the distance, the echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by the sound of waves crashing against the hulls of ships. Miriam watched the retreat from afar, the weight of the battle slowly lifting as she saw the transformation of hearts and minds. The struggle for freedom would continue, but now they fought not just against tyranny but for the ideals that bound them in a collective humanity. In their hearts, the soldiers held on to the promise of a future where battles would not need to be fought with blood, but with understanding and compassion. And as they sailed away from Dunkirk, history was rewriting itself, one courageous choice at a time.